Welcome to Lesson 2.5. Now that we've gone through biomolecules and metabolism, we're going to review chemical reactions and then discuss energy and reactions. That's going to lead us into our introduction on enzymes. So let's get started. Remember to fill in your notes and write down your vocab as we go through this. So we've already seen a few chemical reactions in this course, but here's a quick review. A chemical reaction is a process that changes or transforms one set of chemicals into another. Some reactions occur slowly, some occur quickly, but all reactions conserve energy and matter, and we generally measure matter with mass. Chemical reactions have reactants and products. The reactants are the elements or compounds that enter into a chemical reaction, and the products are the elements or compounds produced by a chemical reaction. All chemical reactions involve changes in the chemical bonds that join atoms and compounds. So this is our photosynthesis equation from Unit 1. This should look pretty familiar. Okay, so just to recall kind of the general structure of a chemical reaction formula, your reactants are on the left-hand side of the arrow or the yield sign. Reactants on the left-hand side, products on the right-hand side. Now, you'll notice on both sides, if you look a little more closely, you're going to have the same composition of elements, okay, or of atoms, right? Everything's going to be conserved, and you're going to have the same amount on the left-hand side of the arrow as you do on the right-hand side. So for example here, okay, if you look at the number of hydrogens, or 6 times 2, 12 total hydrogens, that's going to equal the number on this side, okay? So chemical reactions and equations are going to balance out to show us that all reactions conserve energy and matter. Now, you don't need to understand how to balance those reactions until next year, but again, just being able to look at both sides is helpful for that concept. So like we just said, some chemical reactions release energy and other reactions absorb it. So now we kind of need to understand energy and look at this in more detail. So energy is the ability to do work or the ability to move or change matter. So in physics, work is equal to the force times displacement, and that force is just mass times acceleration. So that's kind of how we get that moving and changing matter. Energy exists in many forms such as potential, kinetic, thermal, electrical, chemical, nuclear. Energy is never lost, but it can be converted from one form to another. Now we have 2 laws of thermodynamics that will be important for us in biology. The first one is energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be converted from one form to another. This is also called the law of conservation of energy, and it tells us that the sum of all energies in a system is constant. The second law of thermodynamics says every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy of the universe. Now that word entropy is kind of hard to understand, but entropy is kind of a measure of disorder. Many energy transfers within living things result in giving off heat. And heat is usually a way that we can measure entropy, because as that randomness or disorder increases, we're going to see that heat being given off into a system or surroundings. This is an important concept for a living system. The high degree of organization of living things is maintained by a constant input of energy and an offset by an increase in the entropy of the surroundings. So if you don't quite understand the second law of thermodynamics, that's okay, because it's kind of more confusing one, but this is a really good diagram of that. Basically everything, like taking in biomolecules, okay, giving off CO2 in cellular respiration, we have kinetic energy, and that reaction is given off as heat. And heat is given off into the atmosphere or the surroundings, and this heat is kind of that measure of entropy. So another common question that we get is the sum of all energies in a system is constant, but you may ask, well, I remember the energy in an ecosystem can't be recycled from our Unit 1, and that is correct. Energy transfer in an ecosystem is complex. Plants make the energy, herbivores eat the plants, carnivores eat the herbivores. Eventually an animal dies, and the microbes return its physical matter to the soil and atmosphere for plants to use it again. However, at this point, that physical material may have passed through several organisms. So all of the energy from the original plant that has been converted or to heat, and nothing is left to recycle. So within us and our surroundings, we are what we call an open system, because we constantly exchange energy from ourselves with our environments. So again, energy within an ecosystem is not recycled. So now we're going to look at energy and chemical reactions a little bit more closely. So energy is released or absorbed whenever chemical bonds are formed or broken. Chemical reactions can release energy on their own, and we call that a spontaneous reaction. Now, don't mistake spontaneously with quickly. Just because something is spontaneous doesn't mean it will occur fast. It could take years, hundreds of years, or even millions of years to be considered spontaneous. Chemical reactions that absorb energy will not occur without a source of energy. So here's another example of a chemical reaction. Okay, we have hydrogen gas, oxygen. They react together to form water, and we get some energy on the product side, meaning energy was kind of released. So this reaction, hydrogen gas, when reacted with oxygen gas, produces water vapor. The energy released in the form of heat, and sometimes when hydrogen gas explodes, meaning that we perceive that as light and sound. So here's a video if you kind of want to watch that reaction. This is what we call the forward reaction. This, like reading it left to right, the forward reaction, and energy is released in the forward reaction. The reverse reaction, okay, or going from right to left, meaning this way, the reverse reaction in which water is changed back into hydrogen gas and oxygen gas absorbs so much energy that it generally doesn't occur by itself. The only way to reverse the reaction is to pass an electrical current through water to decompose the water into both gases. So our forward reaction for this specific example of a chemical reaction, this left to right forward reaction releases energy, while the other reaction, the reverse reaction, you have to have an input of energy in order to decompose water back into its original two reactants. So in any chemical reaction, chemical bonds are either broken or formed. The general, notice that says general, underlined, not 100% of the time, but the general rule is when chemical bonds are formed, heat is released. And when chemical bonds are broken, heat is absorbed. Molecules inherently want to stay together, or they want to be more stable. So formation of chemical bonds between molecules requires less energy as compared to the breaking of bonds between molecules, which requires more energy. And that results in heat being absorbed from the surroundings. So we classify those chemical reactions in two ways: energy releasing and energy absorbing. An endothermic reaction is a type of reaction where energy is absorbed and the energy of reactants is less than the energy of products. An exothermic reaction is the opposite. It is a type of reaction where the energy is released and the energy of the reactants is greater than the energy of the products. But both reactions need an input of energy to get started. So now we're going to look at these in terms of metabolism, which we discussed a couple lessons ago. So this slide looks pretty familiar, right? From our previous lessons, we've had this main idea of metabolism. And then down here, we talked about breaking down monomers, building them back into polymers, and this whole big picture where you can kind of see examples of catabolic and anabolic reactions. So in general, again, that word general, not 100% of the time, but in general, exothermic reactions make up catabolism because they break down molecules that release energy. So one example of that is ATP hydrolysis to form ADP, and that process released a lot of energy. In general, endothermic reactions make up anabolism because they synthesize or create biomolecules and absorb energy. So that example is ADP joining with a phosphate group to create ATP. You had to add an input of energy to join that group back together. So again, both endo and exothermic reactions still need energy to start the reaction, and that is called the activation energy. That is the energy required to get a reaction started. So looking at these two, what we call energy diagrams down here, how does the energy of the reactants and products differ between an energy absorbing reaction and an energy releasing reaction? So pause here, kind of examine both of these energy diagrams on your own. So we're going to look at this a little bit more closely. Okay, so this is an endothermic reaction. If you go back to this one, again, this is endothermic. This one is also endothermic. Looks a little bit different, but has the same exact concepts. So here's an endothermic reaction energy diagram. In the case of an endothermic reaction, the reactants are here at a lower energy level compared to the products up here. In other words, the products are less stable than the reactants because they are at this higher energy level. Since we are focusing on the reaction in a forward direction, it's moving towards more unstable products. Okay, this overall delta H, and delta H, you don't have to know what it is quite yet, okay, but it's useful for this information. But delta H is the change in heat energy. Okay, so this delta H here is positive, meaning that energy is absorbed from the surroundings. The transition state is this line up here, kind of where we reach this peak, and the transition state is an intermediate stage where the chemical bonds are partially broken, partially formed, and this exists at a higher energy level than the starting reactants because it's very unstable. Again, because everything's kind of mixed up there trying to form into the products. The EACT, this red line, and this EACT, this is just another way to write the activation energy, okay? And that is, again, the energy required for a reaction to get started. So you see that the reactants kind of have to go through this and kind of reach this top of the peak, overcome this energy barrier in order to get to the products. So again, that's just the activation energy. So here's an example of an endothermic reaction. One common example is an instant cold pack. These aren't the kinds that just contain water that you put in the freezer, but the ones that you can buy that are single use, and you can crack them and start to feel them get colder. There are a lot of ingredients that could be used for a cold pack, but a common ingredient is ammonium nitrate and water. So here's the equation up here. The cold pack becomes activated when the barrier between the water and the ammonium nitrate is broken, and that allows them to mix. So you add that water, and then we get the ions. So when the ions dissociate or dissolve because of that water added, energy is taken in from the surroundings, and that makes the cold pack feel cold to us, okay? Because again, that energy is absorbed. The product ions here are less stable than what the original ammonium nitrate was, okay? Because these two have a higher energy level. So an easy rule of thumb in this picture here is a really good visual. An easy rule of thumb is if a reaction absorbs energy from the surroundings, it feels colder to us. And we would most likely know that that's an endothermic reaction if you are feeling that coldness. Now let's look at an exothermic energy diagram. In the case of an exothermic reaction, the reactants here are at a higher energy level compared to the products, which are down here. Okay? In other words, the products are more stable than the reactants because, again, they have a lower energy level. Overall, the delta H, which again is that change in heat energy for the reaction, is negative because energy is released in the form of heat. Notice the activation energy up here, or the energy required to get the reaction started, is much lower in this particular exothermic reaction than from the previous energy diagram for the endothermic reaction. So one common example of an exothermic reaction is any type of combustion. Combustion, is really simple terms, means any type of hydrocarbon reacting with oxygen or fire. So I put this picture of fire here because if you think exothermic reaction fire, that is a good rule of thumb. So here's a common ingredient found in gasoline, octane. So when gasoline burns, it releases carbon dioxide and water as products, and we feel that heat being given off. And that heat or energy is one of the major pieces that powers your car. So the products or ions are more stable than the reactants because they have a lower energy level. Or you can also think of it like this. We know gasoline is a fairly volatile substance that easily ignites. So you can think of it as being unstable compared to the carbon dioxide and water that is given off. So just like that picture before, here it is again. An easy rule of thumb is if something releases energy into the surroundings, therefore feels warmer to us, it is most likely an exothermic reaction. So now let's look at the effect of enzymes. So some chemical reactions that are essential to life happen so slowly or require such high activation energies that they could never take place on their own. A catalyst is a substance that speeds up the rate of reaction by lowering activation energy. Enzymes are proteins that act as biological catalysts. So the role of enzymes is just to speed up chemical reactions that take place in living things and cells. And recall from our biomolecules lesson, proteins are very diverse. The protein shape, we talked about briefly the protein folding, but the overall theme from that was the protein shape is extremely important for the protein function. And some proteins are formed in such a way to speed up processes in our bodies, or some proteins are formed in order to become enzymes. So let's look at this energy diagram with the enzyme. So first, what type of reaction is this? Endothermic or exothermic? So pause and see if you can recall. If you said exothermic, that is correct, right? Because remember, the energy of the reactants is higher than the energy of the products. Now the blue line, okay, here, this blue line here is the reaction without an enzyme, and the red line here is the reaction with an enzyme. Notice both reactions, the red and the blue lines, start at exactly the same reactant energy and end at the same product energy, okay? That makes sense because the reactants and products don't change, but instead you're just looking at the activation energy, which is lowered. So these two arrows here, okay, show the activation without an enzyme, that's this first one, and this one here shows the activation energy with an enzyme. Okay, you notice with the enzyme, the arrow or the energy needed to overcome this peak, okay, that was here, this is much smaller with an enzyme. So if given a graph like this, you would need to be able to show activation energy without an enzyme, okay, or just the distance from the reactants to that peak or transition state, and activation energy with an enzyme. Again, from reactants to the transition state or peak, and this will be lower with an enzyme. And because that activation energy is lower with an enzyme, that is what causes the reaction to proceed faster. So now, how do enzymes exactly lower activation energy? That's going to be a question for next lesson. So for now, just understand that the enzymes lower activation energy, which then causes the reaction to proceed faster. So now we're going to look at a couple of examples of enzymes. The first one is carbonic anhydrase. So carbon dioxide combines with water to produce carbonic acid in our bodies. Carbonic acid is highly soluble, which just means that it dissolves really easily. This reaction enables the blood to carry carbon dioxide to the lungs, and you can kind of see what's happening here: body tissues, capillary, lungs. You can see those being carried and formed. In the lungs, the reaction is reversed and produces carbon dioxide gas, which you exhale. In our bloodstream, an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase speeds up this reaction by a factor of about 10 million. And without it, carbon dioxide would build up in our bodies faster than we could remove it from our bloodstream. So enzymes within living things are extremely important, okay, for us maintaining homeostasis. Here is another example of an enzyme, catalase. And catalase is also a common enzyme found nearly in all living organisms. Found predominantly in the liver for humans, it breaks down harmful hydrogen peroxide into oxygen and water. So here we have the formula for hydrogen peroxide. The yields arrow here, we show catalase being involved, and then it's broken down into harmless byproducts, water and oxygen. When this reaction occurs, oxygen gas bubbles escape and create what looks like foam. So if you've ever seen like peroxide used on an open cut or something, you kind of notice that bubbling. The reaction here is pretty similar for what catalase does to peroxide. So we've reached our exit ticket. Go ahead, pause here, and answer these 4 questions in your notes. All right, go ahead and check yourself. So catalase was one of our examples of enzymes. It breaks down peroxide into oxygen gas and water. The energy needed to get a reaction started is activation energy. Why do the reactions with enzymes occur quicker than the reactions without an enzyme? Because enzymes lower the activation energy for reactions. And how exactly do they do this? We're going to talk about that next class. Chemical reactions that absorb energy are called endothermic reactions. So that is the end of lesson 2.5. Make sure to go back, check your notes and vocabulary, and reach out to your teachers with any questions. Thank you for watching.